I'm really pleased and honored to have this opportunity to introduce and have a public conversation with Dr. Pat Sikes. I want to go back a little bit in time to begin. This scene takes place in the Illini Union at the University of Illinois. I'm really not sure at this point what year it was, but it was early in the 2000s, probably 2005 or 2006. I was returning hurriedly from a long lunch with friends, as happens often at the academic congress referred to as ICQI. I checked my shoulder bag as I entered the union, but I can't find the paper on which I had scratched my schedule. As I get to the second floor, I see doors closing, so I dash into the last open one. I don't recognize any of the people in this room. No problem, there are rarely any bad sessions at the Congress. I sit back and relax. Midway through the session, a woman identified as Pat Sikes is introduced. I don't recall the details exactly of the paper she gave, as well as how she gave it. Her sincerity, her honesty, her comfort, and especially her ethical stance. It may have been one of her papers on dangerous theories or dangerous liaisons. I honestly don't recall. What I do recall vividly was approaching her briefly after the session to tell her how much I admired her presentation, then dashing out of the room to try to find Carolyn and tell her I discovered an educational sociologist who was a kindred spirit. Later, I regretted that I hadn't tried harder to arrange a meeting with Pat, because it would be a good many years before we ever had contact again. Though we did serve together on the ICQI Book Award Committee beginning in, I believe it was 2012, which took place over email. I don't think we ever did meet again face-to-face until a couple of weeks ago over Zoom, the first of two inspiring conversations, each of which well exceeded the time we had reserved to talk. For many years, Pat couldn't attend ICQI due to her responsibilities as a daughter, a parent, a mentor, and a caregiver. But these responsibilities appeared never to diminish her creativity, originality, and productivity as a scholar teacher. Over the course of her research life, she has published solo-authored books, including Parents Who Teach, Stories from Home and from School, Teaching About Race Relations, co-authored books including Researching Sex and Lies in the Classroom, Allegations of Sexual Misconduct in Schools, co-edited handbooks such as the Routledge International Handbook of Narrative and Life History, and edited the 4-volume Benchmark in Social Sciences series, Autoethnography for SAGE. For people who like to count things, I can tell you that her published work includes, in addition to her solo-authored books, 8 co-edited books, more than 60 refereed articles, and more than 50 books chapters across a breathtaking array of topics, including research ethics, qualitative methods, social justice, moral panic, teacher-student sexual relations, academic freedom, vulnerable teaching, and recently experiences of children with a parent with young onset dementia. The way I look at it, her research life testifies to a determined effort to take experiences that have too often been shrouded in secrecy and bring them into public awareness. She served also for 4 years as the editor of the British Educational Research Journal and continues to serve on the editorial board of numerous journals. In 2018, Pat was awarded the John Nisbet Fellowship by the British Educational Research Association for an outstanding contribution to educational research over a career. I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to talk publicly with Pat. And please, you can liberally use the chat, which is open, and I'll try to keep my eyes on that as well, and reserve time, perhaps the last 10 minutes or so, if we can, for conversation, discussion with those in attendance. So to begin, Pat, I wanted you to be the one to reflect on your prodigious research career that has spanned more than 48 years. Looking back, how would you depict the arc of your research life? I like to think about a life in academia as more or less a calling. A lot of people talk about it as a job or a career. But I wondered, in reflecting back too, if you can identify some kind of calling that came to inspire your work and productivity.
Well, thank you for all of that, Art. And it was 2005, and I remember it. I can't remember what the paper was, mind you, but I can remember. And I can remember thinking, oh, Bochner spoke to me, which is pretty special, pretty special. Well, as you said, over 48 years, I've been around a very long time. I have been around a long time, and that's why I think I've done as much as I have. And in fact, for somebody who did really, really badly at school, I was not an academic child, working class background, you know, that sort of story that many of us shared, particularly back in the 70s, early 70s. I didn't even really know what a university was. I decided I wanted to be a school teacher, and I went into teacher training, trained to be a teacher. And I had a boyfriend who was a teacher, and he was involved in a curriculum development project, a big curriculum development project in England that was sponsored by the Schools Council, which existed in those days and was about innovative curriculum across the range. But David was an historian, was involved in this project with a great philosopher of education who died far too young, a guy called Lawrence Stenhouse, who some of you may have heard of. He did quite a bit of work in the United States and throughout the world, but anyway. So David was involved in this curriculum project, which involved teachers getting together at weekends and talking about what they were doing, and they were teaching about controversial issues using a neutral chair strategy. So I'd go along to these conferences and I'd get talking to Lawrence, and over the 3 years of my teacher education course, I thought, I quite like this research thing. I think I might like to become one of these people, though I'm not clever enough to do that, I don't think. Anyway, Lawrence would talk to me at conferences, and I did my 3 years, trained to be a teacher, was rubbish at it, totally rubbish at teaching children. And then he offered me a job on a project as a research assistant. So I went straight from teacher training college and into a research assistant's job. Then I did my 3 years PhD. Our system for doing PhDs in England is quite different to the one in North America. And then I went into a job where we were looking at teachers' lives and careers using life history method. And so it went on. So it was during doing the reading from the Chicago school, people like Florian and Znaniecki, Everett Hughes, Berger and Luckman and others, not the Chicago school, but around and that. And then I read The Sociological Imagination, and that was it. That was it for me, because I was completely and totally convinced by the exhortation for sociologists to use the sociological imagination to make private troubles public concerns. And I'd already decided that it was people's stories rather than statistics and numbers and things. That was what life was about, and that telling those stories and sharing those stories was a way to engage with people, and to potentially make change in the world, because we don't know what goes on in lives, and it's sharing the difficult stories that gives us those insights. And so I went from there, began to become more interested in life history, began to become interested as time went on in this exciting new approach that Carolyn and Art were writing about. And that was it, really, in a nutshell, you know. I mean, I do trace all this back to my nana, my grandmother, who was a great raconteur and who was always telling stories about people's lives. And I learned so much about lives and things from her, that was where it was at for me. And then I began to think about how I thought that there were some inherent problems with some of the statistical and quantitative research that was being used and was around and continues to be, because I felt that by distancing those numbers from people's lives, there was an ethical disconnect there. So I began to become increasingly interested in research ethics. So over the last few years, ethics, well, not the last few years, probably 25 years, when you get as old as me, you begin to think that it's not long ago, ethics and stories and narrative and autobiographical approaches are what has been my guide. And again, as I say, all coming back to making private troubles public concerns. And of course, when you do that, you can end up questioning dominant narratives, and that can get you into trouble and bother. And so I've had a bit of that in my time, you know. So, yes. I mean, does that answer, does that give you a sort of
Well, that's
synopsis?
fine. It's wonderful. And it certainly gives us the context for your experience. Let's stay on the topic of ethics, which you've written so beautifully. There's a term in one of your publications that I believe relates to one of you, an expression of one of your children, the term dodgy. And I couldn't help thinking as I read that and reread that piece, how dodgy I may have been when I did my book, and I was dealing with stories that took place so many years before, and for which I didn't really have field notes, and which did involve the lives. Most of the people in that sense were no longer with us. They were deceased. But I know when I did write toward the end of the book about the ethical concerns that I had, it was quite easy to just kind of skim over it. So talk to us a little bit about dodginess and how that term, what it means to you and how it can be applied more generally to other people's work, and how we should be thinking about ethics, especially with regard to personal narrative and autoethnography.
Yeah, I think that probably one of the things, I mean, I've examined an awful lot of PhDs in the United Kingdom and in other places, and because I had it was known that I had an interest in and experience of doing autoethnography, and that I was well disposed to it, because obviously not everybody is. I have been asked over the years to examine a lot of autoethnographic doctorates, and fairly early on, I began to become aware that some of them were very problematic. And one of the first ones that really made me realize this was You know, the business is, if you put your name on an autoethnography, and if you are telling the story as it was, anybody is traceable. And it turned out that I examined this PhD that was submitted to a university a long way from where I was working. And I know England's a small country, but anyway, compared to America. And I was reading and reading, and I realized I knew somebody who was in there and who was being described in very, very negative terms. Very, very negative terms. And it was the first time I came across what I have come to call sometimes revenge autoethnography. And that is, I mean, what I'm going to say now is really quite simplistic, and it's obviously much more complex, but I think that there is a real danger in telling our stories that we want to tell and putting the perspective across that we want to tell in a format that is saying it's academic knowledge and it's within an academic tradition, when maybe it isn't quite like that. And I think one of the things that's made me think about, one of the pieces of writing that I read that made me think about this was Tony's piece about his dad, writing about his father, and how his dad wouldn't necessarily read what he wrote, or family members don't. And yet we put them out there. And I mean, we can find those people. And it's problematic. I don't know. I mean, in England, if you do an autoethnography for a study or for a PhD or for a master's or whatever, you have to go through ethical review. And I know that that hasn't always been the case in other places of the world. And I used to do an awful lot of ethics reviews, and very often people wouldn't have thought through the implications of telling their stories or telling family members' stories. And sometimes those stories could do a lot of harm. I mean, there was one PhD that I examined where I and the internal examiner, I was the external examiner. In England, what happens, and somebody from your institution reads and examines, and somebody from another institution does it, and then you come together when you've written your first reports, and then you have a viva. And this thesis reported a murder that apparently hadn't ever been investigated by the police, but it was part of the student's story. And, you know, so it's not just it. So we had to do something about that. We had to do something about that, we felt. So putting stories out there and linking them to names can be a very, very dangerous and a very, very dodgy enterprise, I think. And we need to be very mindful that we're not doing harm by telling a story that may not be problematic to us. And I've seen far too many examples of that sort of thing. And of course, I've seen loads and loads more examples of really good work. But, you know, so I think we have to be very, very careful about how we tell our stories. Now, I have a story that I really want to tell at the moment, and I want to write about it because I think it's a story that is pertinent to a lot of academics about joint writing ventures. And I've mentioned this to you vaguely when we were talking. I can't write that story. There's no way I can write that story. Not in the way I would want to write it. I mean, obviously, you know, I've been thinking about it and thinking about other ways in which I might do it. But you wouldn't need to be a rocket scientist to work out the characters that are involved in that story. And I don't think I should do that.
Well, I recall a lot of dilemmas in PhD students who were doing interviews with other people, and they were doing some autoethnography with interviews. And at the proposal stage, they would say, I'm going to submit everything I write back to my interviewees, the people I've interviewed, and get their approval before I would put it in my dissertation. And I also had some misgivings about that because I would forewarn the students, okay, if you do that and they say no, I don't want you to write this, even I'll acknowledge that I said those things. You could lose your dissertation. So, and in a lot of qualitative research at that stage, there's a lot on the line.
There is a lot on the line. And I mean, you're talking about examples where it's possible to take it back.
Yes.
People are often dead, you know?
Right.
And or people haven't got the, like when Tony was talking about his father isn't going to read academic journals and things. And we might think, oh, we can write it, we can publish it in a place where nobody will ever know. But, you know, there are people in this chat room now who know that doesn't always work.
And the issue of consent revolves around power as well. And I don't know how I want you to talk a little more about your research with children of parents with early onset dementia. But I recall when I was taking care of my mother and would take her to doctors, and the whole issue of consent for various procedures came up, and she wasn't really capable of giving consent at that point. So consent, everyone uses the term consent, but you can persuade someone to give you consent, or you can hear them giving you consent when they're not really giving you consent. These are right. Really sticky issues.
They are really sticky issues. And I mean, you said you'd like me to talk about the dementia work, and I'm really keen to do that, because that's what's preoccupied me since probably around 2010. And in our original conversations, you talked to me about me living an autoethnographic life, and that sort of took me back, and I went away and thought about that. But I think you're right. I mean, I don't mean I think you're right, but I think that does apply to the way that that I have lived my life, again in pursuit of the making private troubles public concerns. I got interested, so I worked in a school of education, a number of schools of education, and my concern has always been more around, or had been until 2010, around aspects of teachers' lives and careers. And I'd use narrative autobiography to investigate different aspects of teachers' lives and careers. And I had done some autoethnographic work around that. So the boyfriend that I talked about, who got me involved with educational research in the first place, had been my teacher at school, my history teacher. And we got into a relationship as when he left the school. We never did anything in those days that was illegal. There were no position of trust rules operating at that time. There've always been relationships between teachers and students. And I wanted to write about how they aren't always, in my view, exploitative, because I used to teach this autoethnographic course about teachers' lives. And every time I taught this course about 7 years, and every time I ran this course, people would come up to me afterwards and say, "Can I tell you a story about me and a teacher?" And I would say, yes. I said, but, and this was long before we had to get ethics review in England. I said, yeah. So if it's a story, I said, I might be interested in doing some work with this. So if you're still in that relationship, would you be happy for me to interview your partner? And they said yes. So I collected a number of stories about enduring relationships, consensual relationships, where the sorts of general thinking about these being exploitative relationships where the young woman was the person, there was questions around that. But anyway, I mean, writing that paper and publishing that paper got me into a hell of a lot of trouble, but never mind. Put hairs on my chest, in a sense.
You
Taught
made
me
the
all
news.
sorts of lessons about
Am
all
I right
sorts.
that piece made the news or something like that? You have
God,
a
it was
story?
on all the front pages.
Oh my gosh.
It's a professors say sex in classrooms is an aid to learning. Well, I never said anything of the sort. It was a load of rubbish. I was completely misquoted. But my children at the time were like 11 and 13, so they had to go into school and be faced with all of these. Oh, it was awful. But anyway, that's another story. But so and I told that story, you know, to say, yes, I have had a bit of an autoethnographic life in that I have made copy of my life and things that have happened to me and then taken them out further. But anyway, to come back to the dementia work, my husband, who had been my boyfriend, we were together for 50 odd years. He'd always been a bit weird, strange in some ways, but he became increasingly so. And long story short, it turned out that at around the age of 52, 53, he was diagnosed when he was 55. He had got two types of dementia, mixed dementia. He'd got vascular dementia, and he'd also got something called posterior cortical atrophy, which is a dementia that initially affects your vision. And Terry Pratchett, you know, the Discworld author, he had posterior cortical atrophy, and he talked about it as a buggeration. He described it as his buggeration. But the things about those dementias are that initially, unlike Alzheimer's, which I was already well familiar with because my mum had old age onset Alzheimer's disease. I tend to call it bog standard Alzheimer's disease, which is probably a little bit disrespectful, but you know, that's what it was. So I knew about that. Well, David wasn't displaying any of these memory issues initially, but he had got these problems. So at this time, our children were about 13 and 15. And none of us knew what was going on. We just knew that this man was becoming increasingly difficult to live with, increasingly unpleasant. And then we got the diagnosis. And a diagnosis is a wonderful thing in some respects, in that it gives you an explanation for what's going on. But there is a big difference between being somebody in their 50s or 40s or whatever, who has an elderly parent with Alzheimer's disease, and somebody who's a lot younger and whose parent might be expected to be doing the ordinary sorts of things that parents do, like going to work, like supporting you, like listening to you, like being concerned about you, and then they're not. So I was very concerned about my children going through what they were going through. And there wasn't any support for this. At the time, young onset dementia was seen as being something really very rare. And it is relatively rare compared to other sorts of dementia, but we're now beginning to understand it better. So I was concerned about how my kids were experiencing this. And how other children might be experiencing it, and what we might be able to do to help them better cope, because nobody understood what was going on. It was affecting their educational careers, it was affecting decisions about relationships, all sorts of things. So I got some money from the Alzheimer's Society UK to do a narrative autobiographical. Sorry, this is Neville, by the way, for those of you who haven't met him. To do a narrative autobiographical study of well, basically, we didn't have any questions. I had a wonderful research assistant, Mel Hall, who's now a senior lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University. And all we did, we put out a call. Are you someone who is a young person? Initially, we were talking to people under 25, but we ended up going up to 30 because we thought if people wanted to share their stories, we really had to hear them. Are you a young person who is concerned about parental young onset dementia? And within an hour of that call going out, we had a number of people responding to us who were just trawling the internet to try and find somebody, some reference, some help for them. So we didn't have any questions in this study. We ended up talking to around 25 people over a period of 18 months to 2 years on a number of occasions, very, very long interviews. So we got a longitudinal sense of how the dementia impacted, and parents died in the course of the study. And we asked no questions, which is an amazing thing for a medical foundation to fund in the first place. And we just said, tell us your stories. And that raises all sorts of ethical questions, doesn't it? About them talking about their parent. Our focus was on their stories. We did all the anonymizing and all of that stuff that people wanted us to do. And our study was absolutely, and yeah, it was unique in the literature and in the research into dementia and young onset dementia. Mm-hmm. But that came entirely out of my experience. I would never have done it. I wish I hadn't had to do it, because my husband lived for 17 years with his young onset dementia. By the time he died, he was incapacitated in every single way that you can imagine. And the toll it took on all of us, me, Robin and Joby, my children, was tremendous, as it was for all the other young people that we spoke with and whose stories we were able to put out there and to share in a way that hadn't been done, you know? But as I said, and coming back to that autoethnographic life, I wouldn't have done that if that hadn't happened to me. I wouldn't even have known about it.
Yes, of course. And yeah, when we talked about the span of your whole research life, I mean, I could certainly at least make the case, and I don't think you're alone here. I think there's many of us probably many of the people in the who are listening to you this morning. You look at someone's CV and you see what they researched, and they're not doing autoethnography, but just in the topics that they choose to research, these are their private troubles, as Mills might say. And too often these stories are shrouded in secrecy. What you've done, what so many other people are doing, is bringing them out into the open. And I wanted to follow up, because I know your even more recent research, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is looking at how people are thinking about genetic testing for Alzheimer's. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Can I just backtrack a little bit, and then I'll go on to that. I said sometimes doing this sort of research can lead to questioning master narratives. And as I said, the Alzheimer's Society UK does an awful lot of work to try and widen awareness and understanding of dementia, and also to try and improve the way in which people with dementia are treated within society. And one of their big mantras is people are still the same. They're the same person that they were before they had dementia. Well, they're not always. They certainly aren't. And one of the things that came out from what our young people's stories were, was I can't think that my mum or my dad is still the same person, because if they were the same person, they'd remember my birthday, they would encourage me, they would show their love for me, they would do all of these things, they wouldn't hurt me. I mean, we had a couple of people who had ended up having to be put into care because their parents had become physically not necessarily abusive, but they were strong and they hurt them. And, you know, we had broken arms and legs and stuff like that. So one of the first papers we wrote, and because we were writing for the Alzheimer's Society, we had to show them what we wrote. And our first paper took a quote from one of our participants that said, "This is not still my mum or dad." And we can't remember the exact title. And we submitted this paper and we got an email straight back saying, well, this isn't our message. If people are telling us that they don't believe that their parent is still the same as they were before in all aspects, then have we not got a responsibility to tell their story as they have told it? So, you know, you have to think about that. Is that doing damage to the seeking to make Alzheimer's and dementia better understood? We decided we'd go with that, and we managed to convince that this was the way forward, you know. So anyway, but that's another ethical area and an issue that became really quite important to us, about what we were doing, what we were saying, could damage good work that was going on, you know. And another similar one where we had issues around that was living well with dementia, because there's a strong push to say that everybody can live well with dementia. Well, they can't. My husband didn't live well with dementia. Not in any way, shape or form. And a lot of our participants' parents didn't. But anyway, so, you know, so that's where the ethics and everything all comes in and mixes up together. And of course, running through all of that, there's my experiences, my children's experiences, and, you know, so they were very involved in validating what I did and giving me permission to do and say the things that I did. But you mentioned my most recent research, which is something that I'm doing with a woman that I met at an Alzheimer's International Conference. She works at City University in New York. And so young onset dementia is rare. Familial dementias are even rarer. And there are a number of inherited forms of dementia. And there's a big international study called DIAN, that's Dominant Inherited Alzheimer's. It's the Dominant Inherited Alzheimer's Network, a study of scientists and doctors throughout different countries in the world looking at these incredibly rare dementias. And it's now possible to do genetic testing for these dementias. And it's also possible to do things with manipulating embryos and so on, if you're a carrier and you want to have a child that isn't going to be impacted by this. And one of the nasty things about some of these dementias is that as it passes on down through the generations, people can often get it at a younger and younger age than their parents or their grandparents. So anyway, we got interested in this through some work we were doing. And so we're currently doing an international study that's looking at how people make decisions about genetic testing, and the sort of sensitivities and the sorts of ethical issues that doing that sort of work is raising are far beyond anything I could even have imagined. I mean, there's stuff out there about the BRCA gene for breast and ovarian cancers and Huntington's disease and so on. But I mean, we've had we haven't really got any funding worth having for this study, because, you know, they said, oh, well, it doesn't really matter because it affects so few people. Well, if you're one of those few people, it certainly does matter, you know. fascinating stuff. And people are so generous and so giving of their accounts and their stories. You know, so while that's not autoethnographic, it's certainly autobiographical and is part of my autoethnographic journey in life.
You've also written about maybe what you might call unintended consequences of doing certain kinds of research. Can you talk at all? Were there particular? I would assume there have to have been, especially with the research on children with parents with early onset, on your effects on your subjectivity, effects on your life when you bring home these stories. I mean, you haven't even published the research, you're just collecting data, you're hearing people tell their stories, things you never anticipated.
Yeah, well, Mel and I did write a paper. It's not an original title, I know, by any stretch of the imagination, that was called Too Close for Comfort.
Right.
And we wrote this paper because of the impact that doing this work was having on us. For me, Mel was doing all the talking with the young people. She did all of that work, and she had no personal links with anybody with dementia before she did this study. But she was very mindful of what was going on with me, because during all of the time we were doing that work, my husband was alive and getting worse, and I'd had to go through things like putting him into care because I couldn't keep him safe any longer. Had to take decisions about what sorts of medication he might be helped by, because he had all sorts of dreadful fears and hallucinations and became very aggressive and all sorts of things. And so Mel would go and collect these stories, and then she would sometimes save the transcript because, you know, it might be something that I was actually going through myself and I couldn't deal with. And then in the course of doing that research, she herself had a miscarriage. And in some ways, she was experiencing some of the grief that the young people we were working with were. And I mean, she would sometimes say, she'd say, I'm on my way home. I've been to so-and-so. I'm on the train on my way home, but I'm not going to do any more work for the rest of the day. I'm going to read a crappy magazine because I just need to get away from what's happening. And there certainly were times where, and there still certainly are times, and David died in 2020, which doesn't actually feel that far away in some ways. But there are times when I have felt completely and utterly dementiaed out, and I just didn't want any more, you know?
We only have a few minutes
we do
left.
that.
I want to give some time for people to comment or ask questions. But one final question for this part. You have throughout your autoethnographic life done so many projects that were on difficult topics, to be sure, and stressful and controversial. Was it fun? Was it ever fun?
I think I've been entirely blessed, but one thing that I will say to you is I don't think I chose these subjects, these topics, these projects.
Chose you.
Yeah. They chose me. And that was certainly the case when I did, me and a colleague, Heather Piper, we did some research that was looking at how teachers, secondary school teachers who had been accused of sexual misconduct with children, which they said they hadn't committed. Now, the graphic type study, how those accusations impacted upon their lives, and having had the experience about sex in the classroom as an aid to learning, I thought, you know, I know what can happen. I know what can happen. And maybe somebody else wouldn't do this study. At that time, I was a senior, I was a professor, I had a chair, had a personal chair. I spoke with people at my institution and I said, I want to do this work. I don't think it's work for somebody who hasn't got the same sort of position as me to do, because I think it could completely mess up your career. And it could, I think. But it chose me. I didn't choose it. And I've been so blessed. I mean, it's been hard, but it's been difficult. But if I hadn't done some of these things, and that makes me sound as if I'm into self-aggrandizement, and I'm not, but I really do have a commitment to getting those young people's stories out there to try and make a difference. And I think we are beginning to make a little bit of, there is some evidence that there's been a shift in how things are understood. And similarly with the accusations work, the accusations of sexual misconduct, we were invited to contribute to a parliamentary service, white paper looking at how investigations were progressed. You know, so yeah, no, it's been lovely, it's wonderful, I'm blessed.
All right, I want to ask those of you who have been listening, comments, questions, any responses. I haven't seen any hands. Okay, I used to remind my students that this was not a spectator sport. How are you experiencing this? Anybody?
You have hands.
Right, well, go ahead.
Brown has his hand up.
Oh, go ahead and speak. I can't see it for some reason. Oh, there you go, Jerome.
Thank you, Art. Pat, thank you very much for an interesting presentation. As an academic, working, and I have 2 master's students who've written also ethnographic pieces. The problem you have, Pat, is you don't know what the ethical issues really are until they've written it. That's the problem. So how can you, so in a sense, you have to look at these on an individual case-by-case basis. My rule of thumb is that they don't mention anyone by name. And if they're going to say bad things about someone, then that's a bit of a no-no, because, you know, someone might identify themselves, but it's a very tricky issue. Pat, it's their story. It's their story. And sometimes people have to write these stories because they've been so damaged by the system that you know, and we as academics, you know, in a sense, we referee that a bit. But I think, you know, whose story is it anyway? It's the person who's writing it. And our job as academics is to just make sure we don't think that's going to harm anyone. With a master's project, Pat, it's going on to a computer database. No one gets to see it, apart from other academics if they so choose, because members of the public can't get onto Moodle and look up student reports. Now, if it's being published, it's a different thing.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think at the institutions I've worked at, master's dissertations have been available, and PhDs certainly are. And I'm very much of the view that if you're doing a PhD, which is one of the definitions is making a contribution to knowledge, that has to be accessible. So you raise the issues of, in England at any rate, I don't know how it works in other places, placing embargoes on work. That's a slightly different issue, isn't it? And yes, I mean, the business about, well, this is my story and I have a right to tell that story and to put it out there into the public domain. I think it does require us to moderate if we're working with students sometimes. And we need to, I think, when we're doing that sort of work, to encourage them to think about the harm that their work could potentially do. But as you say, often you don't know until it's written. I wouldn't disagree with that. It's a tricky business. I mean, it's good that it's a tricky business because it's a worthwhile business.
Mark Freeman has his hand up. Mark?
Art, I think Katrina and David might have had their hand up even before mine.
Oh, okay.
So,
David and Katrina.
That's very kind of you, Mark. Thank you. But just a couple of things. Pat, fantastic talk. I'm a great admirer of your work, and it's really lovely to see your face. And it's a bit like you saying when you went to QI and you spoke to Art. I said to David, wow, Pat's on. So thank you, Art and Caroline, for bringing Pat Sikes. It's been wonderful to listen to you. But just the conversation that everyone's been having reminds me at the moment, Prince Harry is doing his show all and the palace are saying nothing. And it's been a real sort of a provocation, I think, for qualitative researchers to see the two ways of tell it all and be quiet and not say anything, and how people expect the palace to say something as it's the only way that they can challenge that, and they're not. And I think there's a lot that we can take from that. So I just wondered whether you had any thoughts about that.
Well, I have actually quoted the Queen for the first time. And you can guess what it is that I've quoted. Recollections may vary. And I thought, I've never thought I'd be quoting the Queen. But yes, I mean, the things that are at stake there, in terms of the private life of Harry and Meghan, and the sorts of things that, you know, my young people or the young people or the people that you have worked with, whose stories you're bringing out there. There's something about the purpose of what you're doing. And as I said earlier, you know, the thing that sometimes concerns me about some of these revenge autoethnographies is that they're purporting to make a scientific, sorry about all this, contribution to knowledge and understanding. And I think that makes a difference sometimes. I don't know. There aren't any easy answers. And I mean, I think the area that we're working in really does highlight that, doesn't it? And I mean, one of the reasons I really got into narrative right at the start was my PhD, which I started in 1979. I had to do, my supervisor says, you've got to do some, show them you can do some proper science, and then you can do your soft sociology stuff. So proper science involved doing tests and using SPSS and stuff like that. And I would go into the school. I was looking at the importance of promotion to teachers as a motivator, and I'd go into school on a Monday morning, distribute a questionnaire, then I'd interview some people in the school. And I remember a young man coming to be interviewed, and he said, can you trace my questionnaire? Can you take it out? He said, I filled it in on Monday and I was really pissed off. I got a new job on Tuesday and I don't think any of those things. So
let's try to squeeze in one more question or comment from Mark.
Yeah, thank you. Pat, first, I just wanted to thank you for your talk. I've done some work in a similar area and I could identify with...
It's an inspiration to me, Mark. I'm so honored that you're there.
I do have a question for you, though, and it has to do with the ethical dimension. In the case of my work on my own mother, she couldn't possibly give, let me say, meaningful consent. You know, if I told her I was writing about her, she would have been thrilled early on, and that would have been that. But she had no idea, of course, what I was writing about and so on. But there was another concern that emerged as well, and it had to do with the fact that as the years passed, I began to record things that she said. And when you do that, of course, you do take away on some level from the human relationship that's there. And of course, I would eventually use her words in chapters and in conferences and eventually in books. And although I can still justify to myself having done all that, I couldn't help but feel at times that I was using her.
Yeah.
Partly for my own theoretical concerns and professional interests and so on. I was wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I mentioned that I run things past if I write about my husband, and I haven't written very much about him at all. And I actually think that, there's some really, really good dementia books out there. There's yours, and then there's what Laurel Richardson's written about her husband with Lewy bodies dementias. I run everything past my children. And my brother-in-law, who was David's brother. And I am very mindful that, it's really weird, isn't it? Because I've probably done some of the biggest in terms of audience it's reached and diverse work, because David was so fucking ill. I'm sorry, but he was. I wouldn't have done it otherwise. So
yeah,
it's hard.
It's all right.
And I'm sorry for swearing.
Oh, hey, we've heard those words before.
We're going to have to leave it there. I think
Yeah.
there's another session coming into this room. I just want to say, for those of you who have your hands up, if you could write anything in the form of a comment or a question on the chat, we're keeping these, and we treasure them. And I know Pat will like to hear any feedback that you have. And thank you for being here. And Pat, as always, we run out of time, and there's not much we can do about that. But I've been, totally immersed in this session, and thank you.
Thank
you for
you.
sharing with
It's
us.
been such an honor. Thank you. And anybody can email me. Shall I put my email
Yes,
address?
yes.
So do feel that you can do that. And thank you. And thank you for giving me the chance. Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you.